So, assalamu alaikum and good evening, good morning, depending on where you all are. It's a pleasure to welcome today Professor Azra Raza, who is the Chan Soon Shiong Professor of Medicine at the Columbia School of Medicine in New York, and a medical oncologist, and the director of the Myelodysplasia Syndrome Center at Columbia University. She's also a wife, a mother, and if you've read the book, you'll know she's nothing short of a revolutionary in some of the thoughts that she has about oncology and how cancer should be diagnosed and treated. Azra Appa, it's a pleasure to have you. Welcome. I'm hoping that this will be a very interesting 1 hour or so that we spend talking to you and discussing your book, The First Cell.
Thank you, Aasim. Thank you to Yaqub and Ramzan Mubarak to all the audience members. I am so honored to be on this stage with you, Aasim.
Thank you. So, Azra, we're departing somewhat perhaps from the normal way in which these book talks are done. All Pakistanis are very interested in overseas Pakistanis who've done well, and they want to know their story and what they did and how they got to where they are today. So I really want to start from the beginning, if you like. Reading the book, your love for the city of Karachi comes through again and again, and that's where you're from originally. I wondered if you'd spend a few minutes telling us about yourself and your early life in Karachi.
What a lovely way to start. कुदरत ने सिखाई थी हमको उस्ताद वहाँ परवाज वहाँ गाए थे वफा के गीत वहाँ छेड़ा था जुनू का साज वहाँ. Everything in my life starts with Karachi. Karachi is present in every sulcus and gyrus, every fiber of my body, and it will always be there. Interestingly, from 8th grade onwards, I was in Islamabad and Rawalpindi. And you'll be surprised to know, Aasim, that my parents were very unconventional parents. So by the time I was in 8th grade, every afternoon when people were asleep, I would come out, go to the garage, sit in the car we had, and back out of the driveway. So I learned how to drive by backing the car out and going back and forth all afternoon. I taught myself how to drive in 8th grade in Islamabad and Rawalpindi. And then my mother, who often needed to go somewhere and the driver wouldn't be available, suddenly realized that this child has learned how to drive. So she started asking me to drive her around. How interesting that since 8th grade, I've been driving a car.
Yeah.
And amazingly, they would give me the car to take to college, which is 11th grade, really. I regularly started driving to college. And that's how I was very famous in Islamabad, because the car often would break down. And to this day, when I go to Islamabad, perfectly older looking gentlemen will come and say, "Haan, humne aapki gaadi ko dhakka lagaya tha."
That's very interesting.
So, and in Karachi too, I went to medical school. I went back to Karachi, and there I was famous for having a Volkswagen at that time, the Beetle.
Yeah.
And it was known as the college bus because, of course, every afternoon, all my friends would get stuffed in, and I'd be dropping them before getting home. But it was a very interesting and a very independent existence. The second thing I'd like to say is that I was very much into music at the time. We were just discovering Bob Dylan, James Taylor, Neil Diamond, Simon and Garfunkel, Shirley Bassey, I was totally crazy about. So I needed to buy all these records, but I wanted to get a really good system, a stereo system, which was so expensive. So I thought, why not make some extra money by teaching girls how to drive? So many girls from my class in medical school, I have taught them all to drive by going to through this NICD, National Institute of Car Driving, because you won't believe, Aasim, it was very rare to have women driving in the 1970s. And people would stop on the street to look and wave at us when we were driving. But I started teaching the whole summer. I would spend spending 6-7 hours teaching how to drive. Just my friends, very rarely did I teach a stranger, and only girls, of course, in those
Hmm.
dual control cars.
All right.
And it was
The
very
real thing.
interesting. Yeah, the real thing. And
Mm.
I made tons of money, with which I started buying the most amazing stereo system, which my friend Jimmy, who was a pilot in the Pakistan Air Force, Jameel Malik, my brother's class fellow, but a very good friend of mine, and very sensitive about musical instruments and systems. He bought me one of the best systems possible in Karachi at the time, a combination of many different Bang and Olufsen pieces and
Hmm.
others. And so I had the best collection of music and the best system, and I had a car, so I was an attractive friend to have at the time.
Very popular, I'm sure.
Very popular.
That's a very interesting story about the driving. I didn't grow up in Pakistan myself, but all the kids I went to school with when I did come here, and my wife later, all told me that that's how they learned how to drive, was backing the car out of the drive when their parents were asleep in the afternoons.
Really? Well, I started the
So
trend, tell them.
clearly, clearly. So one thing that comes through very clearly in conversing with you, and you started with poetry today as well, and it's interspersed throughout the book, quotes from Iqbal, Ghalib, Ahmed Faraz, and so many other poets. Where did the love for poetry come from? Is that from your parents, your family, or is that something you picked up along the way?
I mean, I think in the poetry is so much a part of our life growing up in Pakistan. I think today also ours is a deeply poetic culture. I live in a deeply unpoetic culture now, so I
Mm.
respect and have value what I have, I don't experience on a daily basis anymore, because no conversation in my family with my parents was almost ever complete without them ending it with an appropriate pithy share. Oh,
Mm.
हाँ जैसा गालिब ने कहा
Right.
या इकबाल ने
Yeah.
या मीर ने. So this was, and also because we came from an oral culture. My father was from Lucknow, my mother was from Aligarh, and theirs was a culture that depended on sort of oral communication in the most stylized, delicate way. It was a
Mm.
courtesy culture. And
Mm.
so they taught us and they made us memorize tons of classical poetry. All seven of my siblings, we are seven,
Yeah.
all
Hmm.
of us can recite a lot of poetry from our memory because they made us do it. So that's where the love began. And then I
Right.
continued it because my parents' trick was, if they understand even a single share, they'll have no recourse but to go and study it deeply.
Right. Right. Okay. And it certainly worked. So you graduated from Dow Medical College, and shortly thereafter, I think you went off to the US. Were you like many Pakistani doctors who sort of thought that they would go spend a few years and come back, or did you always think you would stay there? How did that work, or did it just
No, I
evolve gradually?
No, I went with the total intention of staying in America because I knew I always wanted to do science.
Mm,
And if I had stayed back in Pakistan, I would have become an activist.
mm,
So I knew that I would go and never come back. I came with the intention. In
mm.
fact, I arrived with a green card. I landed at
Okay.
JFK and I
Hmm.
had a green card because I had that intent. I knew I wanted a serious career in science to cure
Hmm.
cancer.
Yeah.
But the important thing is for you to note that 43 years later, what have I become in this country? An activist.
Yes, a cancer activist. Well, that's the best of both worlds, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right. And so you trained as a medical oncologist, and in fact, in the book, you described the fact that you started training as a pediatric oncologist to treat children with cancer, and then switched to adult oncology. Is that correct?
Well, I arrived in the US January 2nd, but my residency wasn't going to start till July 1st, as you know.
Right.
So I
Yeah.
had 6 months, and I'm not the kind of person who can sit at home, especially when
Mm.
I had, now I'm in the US. I better not waste a second curing cancer. That
Hmm.
was my sort of overarching theme in life at the time, and it continues to be still. So my sister, older sister, had just finished a rotation at Roswell Park Cancer Institute in Buffalo. I was staying with her, and I said, "Can they take me? So just 6 months I can work at the Cancer Institute." And she had rotated in pediatric oncology. So she's talked to her chief, Arnie Friedman, and he said, "Look, if your sister is half as good as you, we'll take her." So obviously I was half as good. So they took me in pediatric oncology, but I was so heartbroken by what we were doing to children because they can't say no. A 2-year-old who has leukemia, you basically hold them down and do a bone marrow. It was brutal. And I used to be crying all the time. And so the attending then passed me on to adult oncology. And that's where I felt more at home. Because adults can yell at you. They can say, "No, we don't want the bone marrow. Go away."
Yeah. Okay. So coming to the book now, The First Cell, which is important to mention here. I think the audience will be, if not largely, but there'll be a lot of Pakistani people in Pakistan watching this, hopefully. So the book is now available in Pakistan. It's being published locally by Lightstone Publishers. And it's important to mention that, obviously we want as many people to buy it as possible, but it's important to mention that you are not getting any royalties when it's from sales in Pakistan. I want to just point that out. So there's no ulterior motives in asking anyone to buy the book here. It is so that, people can read about it, learn about the alternative view on diagnosis and treatment of cancer, and hopefully spread the word. So the book is based, I don't want to oversimplify it, but the book is based around particular patients, which makes for very powerful, almost riveting reading, but is fairly unusual, I guess, in a serious book about cancer. How did you decide to do that? Why did you decide to base it largely around sort of extensive vignettes about particular patients?
You're an oncologist yourself, Aasim. No, sorry. You are a gastroenterologist who treats GI cancer patients.
I'm not the perfect thing, but...
But you see a lot of cancer patients. I mean, that's all you do. And the one thing you know very well is what we see is so profoundly moving. And at a human level, it is so emotionally gripping that unless we convey the extent of human anguish through telling their stories, we would not be doing justice to them, to our patients and to the field. So it has always been very clear to me that stories are better than statistics. One of the things that struck me when I came to the West and started working here is the kind of distinct separation between Athens and Jerusalem, between reason and passion. And in fact, one of my friends, a very famous woman and a great author, Barbara Twersky, wrote a book called Mind in Motion. I recommend this book to everybody. A brilliant woman. One of the things she says, Aasim, is that if you look at compare the Eastern versus the Western way of thinking and mind, let's say you compare Asia to America, what you notice is that even in traffic patterns, there's a lot more complex traffic on the streets, say in Pakistan, as compared to, say, Buffalo, New York, where grids are laid out, in very linear forms, and you can go from Avenue 1 to B to 2 to 3. But in Asia, it's far more complicated. And one of the things that she does a lot of studies in this area to show that basically this street scene of complexity is also reflected in social interactions, because we have to negotiate with larger families. We don't normally have this nuclear family of father, mother, and 2 kids. We have more extended families. I mean, in our home, and as in yours in Karachi, people would drop by with like 6 children at lunchtime, and it was perfectly expected. And you know that, oh, jaldi roti pakao, extra
Mm.
chawal banao type of
Yeah.
thing. So, but it enables, in a way, this negotiation with complexity allows the Eastern mind to negotiate rather seamlessly also in more complex issues.
Mm.
You see, so for me, it wasn't like patient is separate from the disease. I mean, the cancer, we are going to be obsessed with curing cancer and we forget all about the patient. That kind of
Mm.
thing, it was anathema to me, because I feel, because of our complex nature, that we have to deal with so many, issues of sensitivity. I shouldn't say that, because this older aunt would be upset, or
Mm.
my mother's best friend would
Yeah.
mind if I tried to come out too confrontational about, this TV program. Even in little things, we try not to be confrontational. We try to negotiate our way. And I think uh, this kind of a divide between East and West struck me very hard right from the get-go. And instead of giving in to becoming like um, this divided person between passion and reason, I maintain my traditions, my tehzeeb, my culture, my sensitivity, and my sensibility. And recently, have you seen? Well, you were trained and grew up in London, in England. Have you seen the series Crown?
Yes. Yes, I have.
And then maybe you'll understand this well, and I'd like you to comment on it. I was very struck by one of the episodes. I was obsessed with it, by the way. I saw everything. One of the episodes, remember the queen, who has been brought up since she's practically 12 or 13 years of age as a monarch, which means she's different. She's
Yeah.
almost divinity, and she's not to behave at any level, show any emotions, or behave like the common man. And yet there is an avalanche or something, and lots of kids get killed somewhere
Yeah.
in England.
Yeah. It's
And
a
then
coal
people
mine
want her to
disaster.
go,
Yeah.
coal mine, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Mm.
she doesn't want to go, because she knows if she is going to face the parents of those children who have died in the avalanche, she won't be able to control her emotions.
Yeah.
So she didn't go, and the entire country dissed her and started calling her
Yeah.
cold-hearted and
Mm.
doesn't care and has no feelings. So finally she goes. And this episode is based on true
Mm.
story. And it reminded me very much of how we are trained not to get emotionally involved with our patients. And
Mm.
yet, patients demand empathy,
Yes.
sympathy at every step from us. So, how do you reconcile these two opposing things? Do you see
Mm.
what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think it's an everyday challenge, isn't it? How to not get too involved and yet to show empathy and to not appear cold and distant from
Yes, and
patients. Yeah.
I was trained by Harvey, who
Mm.
later I married,
Yeah.
in everything in medicine and oncology. And this was one of his strongest points always: do not get involved with your patients, don't get too close to them, because emotions cloud reason.
Yeah.
And yet, when Harvey himself gets diagnosed with
Yes.
cancer, Aasim, the first thing he did is
Yeah.
turn to me and he says,
Yeah.
"As you're going to take care of me."
Yeah.
I was aghast. I said, "What are
Mm.
you saying? All my life you told me
Yeah.
not to take care of someone you're emotionally involved with." He said, "No,
Mm.
I can only trust you. I'm sorry. I can
Yeah.
trust your judgment and no one else's. So you
Mm.
have to do it."
Right. So it's very interesting when you talk about the different cultures in the West and in our traditional Eastern culture, because I think in many ways in the book you show both sides of that, don't you? You show the Eastern caring, nuanced side of your personality, and yet in your attempts or your reasoning behind wanting to change how cancer is diagnosed and treated. You're very forthright and very direct in your opinions there. So I think that's a very interesting point you raised there, because I think it's very clear that you've 43 years in the US have not left you untouched, clearly.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so so you've talked about Dr. Harvey Preisler. I was going to talk about him next in any case. So your mentor was I think he was the head of your residency training program, presumably, was Dr. Harvey Preisler, whom you later married, and whom you later were the primary caregiver for too, when he was himself diagnosed with a form of cancer. And again, you touched on it earlier. You know, that's pretty unusual, isn't it? I mean, even in our country, I think we tend not to want to treat our own, or we are taught that we should not be trying to treat our own relatives and family and friends and so on, because it's impossible to detach emotionally. And you know, you were trained in that school, and as you point out in the book, that was one of the main things that one of the very important things that he taught you, not to get overly emotionally attached to your patients. So how did you handle that? And you know, when he asked you, why did you accept?
Yeah. I felt a cleavage in my mind, as if my brain was split. I tried to match it seam by seam, but could not make them fit. The thought behind I strove to join unto the thought before, but sequence raveled out of reach like balls upon the floor. It's hard to explain what the experience is of standing on both sides of the bed simultaneously. As a loving wife, mother of my 4-year-old, and on the other hand, as a cold, calculating, thoughtful oncologist.
Yeah.
But love conquers everything. I knew that Harvey depended on me. He was so brilliant that as a high school student, his IQ was not measurable. And he had dedicated his life to cure cancer since he was 15. So you couldn't delude him with false hope.
Right.
He knew exactly what it meant to see that shadow expanding on the MRI.
Yeah.
And yet, Aasim, he would turn to me after every other expert had had their say. He would turn to me and say, "So what do you think, Az?" And that was the moment when he was appealing to me to tell him how he should feel.
Right.
And I took infinite care not to break his spirit ever, without lying, without delusional ideas of you are going to be cured, don't worry, Harvey, this is going to be fine kind of nonsense. But even somebody like him needed hope.
Which and again, it's very clear from the book that it was quite a long illness, wasn't it? It was 4 or 5 years, I think.
Yeah,
he struggled with the disease.
But you know, even though I had been an oncologist already for 20 years by then, yet until I shared a bed with a cancer patient, I had no idea how painful a disease it is.
You know, there's a passage in the book that I think stood out for me. I mean, it says so much about you, I think, as a person, as an oncologist, as a wife, and I think it really sets the scene for the entire book. I wondered if you would mind reading that for us. I sent it to you a little while ago. It's on page 83 in my edition. It's in the chapter on pair.
Yes. Well, you know, Aasim, as a background, I just want to tell the audience and you that when I started to write this book, I had no intention at all of talking about myself. I was just going to talk about all the other patients, that are in there in the book
Yeah.
already. And the final impetus to write the book was one of the patients, Andrew, and I couldn't just sit back and let more Andrews die. So I had no intention. And yet, when I started writing about the other patients, then I realized it would be unfair for me to hold back my story while I'm writing about others with such granularity. And that's when I started to write about Harvey. And once you start recounting your own story, then it became sort of almost like a memoir, because now our own experience with cancer at a family level, at an individual level, at the level of an oncologist, everything acquired a new kind of flavor. So the passage you asked me to read, I wanted to give this background that once I started to talk about Harvey, then I felt that I had to convey somehow the um, kind of anguish that we went through. So many a night, now I'm reading from the book, many a night, I woke up to see Harvey sitting perfectly motionless at the edge of the bed, with his back to me, deep in thought for what felt like interminable hours. What does time mean to people who are running out of time? An inexplicable, intuitive reticence restrained me from interrupting the trafficking in his mind. How does a man hearing the footsteps of death approach closer every day negotiate the themes of dying, loss, pain, grief, the withering sense of waste, the unbearable, crushing sadness of things that will be left undone? How could it be otherwise? Cancer chipping away at the body relentlessly in slow, steady, excruciating blows. The lucid, sharp, coherent mind, on the other hand, forced to reside in an aching skeletal corpus, documenting each ignominy with sensorial precision. In those dark Chicago nights, we were two tormented souls caught in our own private hells, frozen into rigid postures, his vertical immobility matched by my horizontal stillness. Both were afraid to acknowledge that the other was awake because that would invite language to intrude, and verbalizing a fraction of what we were suffering, objectifying the pain in words, no matter how frugal the language, risked the diminishment of its caustic, dizzying, disorienting potency. His physical and mine emotional. Soon I would be speaking in rooms forever depleted of his voice. I would be breathing air that would no longer contain his breath. Even as I tried to control the pounding in my chest, my mind, hostage to surreptitious invasions of rationality, would coldly conduct a microscopic analysis of how to define my feelings precisely, to classify whether it was mourning for Harvey or anxiety for Scheherazade and myself having to live without him. Thoughts and emotions, conflicting and confusing, attacked simultaneously, smashing through any residual protective shields of hope, driving home the murky pathos of the coming emptiness in my life, the lonely days ahead of me, with a fierce, violent acuity that pierced with physical brutality, choking my parched throat, triggering waves of nausea. Do other cancer patients experience variations on these themes? The vertigo of evanescent, soul destroying, irreducible suffering? Do they run their weary fingers through serrated edges of anguish, say farewells in unspoken, unheard of languages in the silence of sleepless nights?
Yeah, that's very, very powerful, I think. And that really, for me, summarized the sort of the patient side of the book, if you like. I mean, there are, as you said, there are several other patients that you talk about. There's a chapter on each patient. And I think you portray that so vividly, the pain and the anguish and the sort of the certainty, that it may take a while, but everyone knows what the end is going to be, and that's so incredibly painful and difficult to deal with. So, Dr. Raza, the central theme of the book is that much of the effort currently being directed to diagnose and treat cancer is a waste of time. That it's like locking the stable door after the horse has bolted. We're chasing cancers that have already developed with drugs that really don't work or that have horribly toxic side effects on the rest of the normal tissues of the body. This is really anathema to current practice of medical oncology. I mean, how did you come to believe this, and what prompted you to write the book and to make that the central theme of the book?
Let me clarify one thing. Today, we are curing 68% of newly diagnosed cancers. So 2/3 of the cancers we are totally curing. I don't want anyone to leave this talk thinking that all our efforts are wasted. No. And the 1/3 of the people who present with advanced cancers, they're doing no better than their fate was in 1930. So I asked myself two questions. One, what are we curing the 2/3 of the patients with? Slash, poison, burn. Surgery, chemo, and radiation. Why? Why are we still using those Paleolithic Stone Age treatments? So where has $250 billion in research gone? What we have done is we are understanding the happenings of this inner life of a cancer cell better. But how has it helped the patient? Why this disconnect between an understanding of biology and trying to improve the outcome for cancer patients? Complete disconnect. Despite 4 million plus papers written on cancer, we are still slashing and poisoning and burning. What's the use of 4 million papers? And then the 1/3 that present with advanced disease, we are spending all our resources in trying to understand metastatic disease and and all we have done is develop treatments that in 70% of the time don't improve survival at all for those patients, 0.00. And in the 30% where survival is improved, it's by a few months mostly. And yet we financially ruin those individuals. 42% of newly diagnosed cancer patients in America by the second year lose every penny of their life savings. So they're not just ruined themselves, their next generation is ruined and no one is cured. Okay, so I ask myself, what is the strategy that works? Why are we curing 2/3 of the patients? Early detection. Early detection and anti-smoking measures. Those are the two main things because of which mortality has come down by 1% a year in the last 30 years, and why we are curing 68%. So what we have done is milked the screening technology we have to the best of its ability. Mammograms, pap smears, PSAs, colonoscopy, these have been used and they have reached their limit. The natural evolution of these is to develop now better technology to find earlier cancer. So I asked myself very simply, how early should early be? Why be happy with stage 1 where we still have to slash mostly? And, what about liquid tumors? We can't slash them. We'll still have to poison and burn them. So how early should be early? And I said, early should be the first cell. Because we know for sure that every cancer begins in one cell. And that cell first makes a few copies of itself and then starts the progression and expansion and invasion process. So my idea is, imagine how this is considered a radical idea that we should try to find the disease early and prevent it from becoming worse. Why is that a radical idea? But no one wants to follow that. Everyone tells me, oh, that's not a new idea. Sure, it isn't about studying how to find the first cell. No one is looking at it. So my contention very simply is that we should try to find cancer very early, for which we need to develop the technology, the right technology, and we need to start monitoring wellness to find illness, and only then will we be able to prevent. Cancer is a silent killer. By the time it's diagnosed, even at stage 1, there are billions of cancer cells in the body or in the tumor. So, how do you find the first cell? Try to go and look at people who are at high risk of cancer. Who are they? Individuals with BRCA mutations, maybe a group. Another very big group would be people who have smoked a lot and have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Another group that I'm interested in is cancer survivors have a higher risk than normal people to get cancer. So we can start monitoring those individuals to try and find the first cell. And with this in mind, I have created a think tank in the country with 30 of the top leaders from academia and industry. And we have all committed ourselves to say we are going to dedicate our efforts in finding the first cell. And MD Anderson, Harvard, University of Chicago, Hopkins, Columbia, Northwestern, I mean, major institutions have joined this effort. Together, we published a paper in Scientific American just 2 months ago, putting out our opinions that we need to go even before stage 1 in the next 10 years. So that's my efforts, Aasim, and to find the first cell and to prevent it from prevent that cell from becoming an end stage monstrosity that we then diagnose right now.
And a recurring theme is the mouse model, and the fact that you don't think that it's really translatable to human beings. What is it about mice that you don't like?
I love mice. I love mice. I don't want them to be slaughtered in the name of science, which is not going to help humans. So let me again be very clear. I'm not at all against mouse models for many biological phenomena that need to be studied in animals. Of course, we should be using, and I mean, we have one of my colleagues, Dr. Stavroula Kosteni at Columbia, has created a mouse model in which you just mutate the beta-catenin gene from the stromal cells of the bone marrow, and the mice develop within 2 weeks acute myeloid leukemia. This is a good model in which to try and catch the first cell, right? This is the kind of thing for which mice are very good. So I'm not against that. What I'm against, though, is trying to do drug development by using mice, saying, oh, I created this artificial cancer in a mouse, and I treated with this drug, and the mouse is cured, so now I can bring it into the humans. No, you can't do that. And that's where the failure has been. That's what a lot of resources have gone to fund that kind of work. I'm against that. Drug development in mice is not a good idea.
Right. How are you received in the oncologic community today? When you go to ASCO or some other major oncology meeting and you stand up and express these ideas, how does the vast majority of oncologists there, how do they receive you? What do they feel about your views?
Before I answer that, you are taking care of a lot of cancer patients. I want to hear your opinion. What do you think should be the future of cancer research? Should we continue doing what we are doing, trying to make these linear, incremental, sort of progress in the coming decade? Or should we try to do something radically different, like look for the first cell? What is your view?
So my view is at least in part formed by reading your book. What I've been very clear about in my own experience over the last 25 years or so is that this very, very small incremental advantage that we see from these new wonder drugs, which cost an awful lot of money, and that's particularly relevant perhaps in our situation here in Pakistan, but I guess it's relevant everywhere. I've been less than impressed by a lot of those. When I see that for X $1,000 you're getting an extra 4 weeks of survival, 3.5 weeks of which may be in hospital. I've been less than enamored of that approach, certainly. But who could disagree with the basic premise that you talk about? That obviously, and the earlier you find it, the better. And if you can prevent it, obviously that's the best. But if not, then finding it early and attacking it at the level of the first cell, figuratively, would obviously make sense. There's no doubt about that. And screening, in a way, is doing the same thing, isn't it? If we could extend that model to all tumors, or to the most common ones, that would be, I don't know, 9/10 of cancer, probably right there.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely.
So I'm so glad that I made you answer the question you asked me. How do oncologists, how are they receiving me? Now, everyone has the same view. They understand what I'm saying is correct. But let me give you an example. Andrew is my daughter's friend. At 22, he suddenly gets diagnosed with a 9-centimeter big, large brain tumor, glioblastoma multiforme, one of the deadliest cancers known to man. And he had a horrible, tormented death after 16 months of suffering. His mother is inconsolable. It was her only son. She has a daughter, but he was her only son. 3 weeks ago, Aasim, Elena called me and she said, Azra, you won't believe the cruel irony that now my best friend has been diagnosed with an advanced glioblastoma.
Oh.
And she said, Azra, it's now 4 years since Andrew died. Surely you must have made some progress. What can I tell my friend that's new now? How shameful, how embarrassing. What have we done in 4 years? And do you expect 4 years from now we'll have a better answer following this kind of path that we are on now? This is the kind of thing where I see no adult in the room recognizing. We keep obsessing over the same one gene, one protein, one magic bullet. We're going to cure cancer by understanding. What nonsense. It's time to wake up and realize that things are different. So how is the oncology world receiving me? How are my colleagues? I mean, I am quite relentless in my assault on the field. And I am not some wilting lily who's going to shut up in front of anybody. And they know it. But the problem is they all understand what I'm saying is true. However, there are two kinds of people who can change the field. Either the young people who have new ideas, fresh ways of attacking things. The problem is if they propose something new, it's risky. The risk is their idea may fail. Failures are not good for promotion.
Yeah.
So the young people don't sort of jump that that whole chasm to make the difference. Now, what about the older people? If they've been doing the same thing for 30 years and their 5 R01 grants are dependent upon mouse models and doing this incremental work, how can they give that up?
Yeah.
So it's very hard, first of all, to argue with me because you know what, Aasim? I see 30 to 40 cancer patients a week even today. I've been doing it for 35 years. Number 2, I supervise a cutting-edge cancer research lab. And number 3, I'm a cancer widow. So what perspective are they going to argue with me about? It's very hard for people to argue with me, especially on stages. They back off and they all tend to agree with me. You know what? I'm not winning any awards or any prizes or any open acknowledgement that I have done anything different. Even though I have collected 60,000 samples in my tissue repository longitudinally from patients I have studied over the years and treated and taken care of. I'm the only person in the world who has ever done something like that. And I support that tissue repository maintenance of $1 million a year myself through raising funds by by holding fundraisers or by patient supported. They want to give me money. I said, no, support the tissue repository. But only after I'm dead and gone will somebody acknowledge that that was a good thing she did. Right now, nobody is willing to even acknowledge that, something so obvious. I'm not winning any prizes, as I said, but then I keep, it doesn't worry me at all. And that's the point, is not to whine about it. But the idea is that I keep remembering Edward Said, my friend, and the great Orientalist, great intellectual. He said something very interesting to me once, and he said, Azra, be very aware of people who win awards and prizes, because that means they have never taken a stand in their life.
Never taken a risk.
Never taken a risk, never stood up for what they believed in. So how am I received? I think, frankly, everyone knows what I'm saying is true, and the field is starting to turn around. And very soon, when we will have success of finding the first cell, somebody else will claim that it was their idea and they have changed the field, which is fine with me.
Yeah, that's not the purpose, is it? I think you point out a very important thing, which is that a lot of the research funding follows that kind of research, doesn't it? I mean, it's going to be much harder to get funding for the kinds of work that you're proposing, I suppose, at least initially, until someone finds that the first cell, as you say.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we're going to be running out of time soon. Where do you go from here? What's the next book? Is it going to be a sequel? Is it going to be something completely different? I know you've already written a book about Ghalib. You're going to try and introduce Urdu poetry more widely in the West, or what's the next venture?
I think I always have these parallel tracks in which my mind works, because actually, and they're not really parallel, they're very much intermingled in my thinking all the time. Poetry informs a lot of the courage I have in speaking up and standing up for the truth. The book dedication to my daughter is with the Sher of Ghalib, Kavish ka dil kare hai taqaza ke hai hanoz. Kavish means struggle. Kavish ka dil kare hai taqaza ke hai hanoz. Nakhun pe qarz us girahe neem baaz ka. As long as there is even one knot in the universe left half undone, my nails owe a debt to that knot to try and undo it, which means continuous struggle. We can never give it up. And as you and I both know, that in science and in life, there is no calm of consummation. Every time we answer a question, it opens up with more questions. And so my quest will continue in that area. I do think that one of my aims for the near future is to bring the patient back front and center into every conversation about cancer, and to make the consumer, the patient, the subject, to empower them rather than empowering hospitals and oncologists and healthcare professionals, empower the consumer.
Great. Well, I think that for the more discerning amongst the audience, I think that outlines clearly what the plan is for the future, I think. Thank you. I think we'll move on to, we've got a question. Dr. Yaqub Bungash has just sent in one of the questions that he's had from the audience. And this is for you. What are your views on genome studies and their use in cancer research?
Fabulous. It had to be done, and we sequenced the human genome with over $1 billion and 15 years and 4 continents being involved in sequencing the first human genome. And now you can do it for a couple of $100 in a week. So genomic studies are fantastic. The problem is that human genome was sequenced 20 years ago. What has it done for cancer? Not much.
Yeah.
So
that's
while
something
it's
you touched on in the book too.
Yeah, it's a very important thing that will continue to help us when we find the first cell and what are the genetic consequences. But Just remember one thing, that when an ovum is fertilized and becomes a zygote and starts to develop the baby, even the DNA of that combined ovum and sperm has to receive instructions from hundreds of proteins to start the work.
Mm.
So, all this concentration on DNA being the code of life, being the only thing that matters, is rather misplaced, as we are finding out. There is
Yeah.
epigenetics, something over the genome
Mm.
that controls the genome. And what controls that epigenome is the environment around the cell and the needs of the cell. So, I feel like, it's the same story. The farther you go out into the sea, the deeper it gets. Now that we sequence the human genome, we realize, oops, there are things which are far more important
Yeah.
around the genome. But that
Yeah.
doesn't mean that sequencing the genome wasn't important. So the answer to your question is, it's very important, but more has to be done.
Yeah. It's not the be all and end all. Yes. So two more questions. I'll take them in reverse order. I think we've partially answered this. What is the role of pharmaceutical companies in your narrative? How much research direction do they control?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because I want to clarify how science is done in America. So let's say I'm an individual scientist at Columbia University. I apply for a grant from the National Cancer Institute for a project that, oh, I want to look at this gene. How is it controlling the cell's proliferation? So the National Cancer Institute gives me that grant, and it's a grant is for, say, $500,000 a year for 3 years. In 3 years, I find that, oh, this gene is actually very important in controlling the proliferation of cancer cells, and stopping this gene by this mechanism would be very useful. So now I want to test that mechanism, right? In mouse studies, I can do that in my lab, but then those are positive. Now I have to take it to the patient's bedside. The only possible way of developing it into a drug is through pharmaceutical company, because that even phase 1 clinical trial will cost hundreds of millions of dollars,
Mm.
and no cancer institute cannot fund that kind of money with that kind of money. So what happens is, pharmaceutical company has to step in, take my finding if they have confidence in me, and then take it to the bedside and run a clinical trial. Now, to run the clinical trial, they invest $1 billion in it, more than $1 billion. It's median of what, $2.5 billion. By the time their drug gets approved, even showing a mild statistically significant improvement of 2 months in survival,
Mm.
they have to recoup all their money, the billions of dollars they invested, and the government cannot control them. So I don't blame the pharmaceutical industry at all, because their intent and their stated goal right from the get go is to make money for their shareholders.
Yeah.
It wasn't like they were hiding their intent under some euphemism of philanthropy or something. No, they are
No, of
there for
course
the
not.
profit.
Yeah.
I am saying that our institutions, FDA and NCI, have abdicated their responsibility by approving these kinds of drugs or allowing all this to happen,
Mm.
and causing this kind of uncomfortable bedfellows of serious scientists like myself having to now depend on a pharmaceutical industry to show that I'm authentic and correct. Why is that the case in this country? These are the things. So I don't want to, I think the role of pharmaceutical industry is very strong for this reason, but we need better institutional control and over better preclinical models to give to them, that look, this has a better chance of working if you invest $2 billion. Right
Great.
now,
Okay. Yeah.
95% of the experimental drugs, 95% that the clinical experimental drugs they try to develop fail.
Yeah.
95% today in America fail. So think that this is an industry investing in a venture that has a 95% chance of failure, because they hope that if they are one of the 5%, they will make billions.
Yeah. And of
Why
course,
is
that's
that
why
happening?
there's
And
then a
that
hard sell for the drug.
95% fail. The 95% failure, Aasim, is because of failure of investigators who give these findings or discoveries made in mice to the drug companies to take to the bedside. So the whole preclinical model is what I'm questioning. The whole system is what I'm questioning.
And that ties in again to the hard sell for the 5% of drugs that do improve survival by a matter of weeks, I guess.
Shameful, embarrassment.
Because they've got to make 100% of their investment from those 5%, haven't they?
That's right.
So there's another question, Azrapa. Okay. This one's clearly from Pakistan. Are you mentoring Pakistani oncologists? I'm sure you're mentoring oncologists without regard to their nationality. But are you doing anything specifically for Pakistani oncologists? I guess that's what this refers to.
No one has asked me ever to do something formally. I'll be happy to, of course. But over the last 30 years since I've had a research lab, I have always taken excellent physicians from Pakistan in my laboratory, trained them, and then they have gone on to develop brilliant careers for themselves all over America. Some are in private practice, some have absconded the field of oncology and joined gastroenterology that pays a lot more here. But no matter where they've gone, they're doing well. They're really, so I must say, I have hundreds of Pakistanis who have trained in my lab, and I'm very proud of all of them. I proclaim it from the rooftops. This one I mentored, and that one was in my lab so many years.
Excellent. So, Azrapa, Professor Raza, it's been a great pleasure being in conversation with you. Dr. Yaqub Khan Bangash is in the background orchestrating everything. Thank you very much to him too. I hope that the book does well in Pakistan. As I said, it's available through Lightstone Publishers. And, you know, I think we owe it to ourselves and to our country to make sure that as many people as possible read the book and are aware of it and buy it. And I'll stress again that Dr. Azrael Raza is not getting anything out of selling the book in Pakistan. It really is a labor of love and an effort to try and promote science and understanding of cancer and the alternate view, if you like, about how cancer should be diagnosed and treated and thought about. So once again, thank you very much, Dr. Azrael Raza.
Thank you, Aasim, and thank you to the audience who took out the time to participate. I'm going to end by giving some advice to the young and old and everybody who cares about the suffering of humanity. In the words of one of my favorite Urdu poets from Pakistan, who's no more, Fahmida Riaz. कुछ लोग तुम्हें समझाएंगे, वो तुमको खौफ दिलाएंगे, जो है वो भी खो सकता है, इस राह में रहजन है इतने, कुछ और यहाँ हो सकता है, कुछ और तो अक्सर होता है, पर तुम जिस लम्हे में जिंदा हो, ये लम्हा तुमसे जिंदा है, ये वक्त नहीं फिर आएगा, तुम अपनी करनी कर गुजरो, जो होगा देखा जाएगा. Go and do your thing, everybody. Pakistan Zindabad. Thank you, Aasim. Thank you, Yaqub.
Thank you.
Khuda Hafiz.
Thank you. Alaikum and good evening. Khuda Hafiz.